Hi, and welcome to Dani After Dark. If you're new here, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss a notification or a new episode. Tonight, we have an author joining us again for the second time. If you saw him here the first time, you already know Zack Kopp. Well, he is here tonight for his brand new book, which is Rare but Serious. And that book dives into countercultural icons and underground movements. Author and cultural historian Zack Kopp unveils Rare but Serious, a riveting collection of essays and interviews that dissect the lives and legacies of some of the most enigmatic figures in modern history. This electrifying volume provides an insightful look into countercultural icons, fringe movements, and the overlooked narratives that have shaped the artistic and literary landscape. Rare but Serious is a must read for enthusiasts of alternative literature, music, and history. This book features incisive essays. I totally knew I was going to butcher a word. Incisive essays on a variety of people and topics, as well as an array and a very wide selection of conversations and interviews. And those are people who played a pivotal role in the underground and countercultural scenes. Through Kopp's lenses, the reader gains a fresh perspective on these influential figures and their impact on contemporary culture. Beyond individual profiles, Kopp delves into larger cultural phenomenon, including the contentious battle over Charles Manson's will, the never-ending Paul McCartney death conspiracy, theories surrounding the Laurel Canyon music scene, and Philip K. Dick's legendary February 3rd, 1974 experience. With each page, Rare but Serious uncovers hidden truths, forgotten histories, and threads that connect these countercultural movements across time. Without any further ado, let's bring him on back to Dani After Dark, author Zack Kopp.
Wow. Thanks, Jenny, for that excellent introduction. You're looking lovely tonight. Thanks for having me back.
Oh, thank you. And thank you so much for being here. And my apologies if I butchered a few words already. It's one
Oh,
of those things I
no.
just always
Not at all.
mispronounce
You're
something.
so nice.
So, congratulations on your latest book, Rare but
It's
Serious,
out.
being out. Let me.
Oh, it's out now. It's got a lot of pictures. Unfortunately, they're not in color. I think there's a link at the Red Penguin Books site where you can view them in color, although the publisher may not have set it up yet. Got all these interviews. Love that cover art. And I'm here tonight to talk to you about the overall theme and some of the stories included in this collection.
Yes. So, before we dive into that, so for those who missed maybe your first time here, what was the background to get you to this, to the concept of writing and publishing Rare but Serious? What led you to that?
So I'm primarily a creative writer. I've written a lot of novels and collections of short stories, but you can't really make much money that way. And it was told to me all along, like, well, you should be a reporter, you should write articles. That's really how you make money as a writer. I got to the point where I thought, okay, I'll give it a try. I heard about citizen journalism. I thought, wow, that's kind of like exactly what I'm already doing. Maybe I should do that. So I knew they wanted a topic. So the first thing that occurred to me was, well, maybe Jim Morrison faked his death. I've heard that rumor, right? So I'll look into that. And I don't want to take too long, but I'll tell the story as succinctly as possible. There was a
Go ahead.
rodeo cowboy in Oregon named Gerald Pitts, and his company was called U.S. Rodeos West. I believe that he has passed away, and God rest him. He made the claim that he had discovered Jim Morrison undercover as a rodeo cowboy named James Lawyer. I know that James Lawyer has passed away, and God rest him. But anyway, so I found all that information online. He was a rodeo cowboy, Gerald Pitts, and he was in charge of reporting the scheduling of different events. So U.S. Rodeos West, a lot of it was rodeo calendars, and then there was a little section about Jim Morrison. and there was a number to call. So I gave him a call, and he didn't answer the phone. I don't even think I left a message. I probably should have at least left a message, but I didn't. And I wrote an article about Gerald Pitz's story, like, isn't that a funny story, and how I tried to call but didn't get an answer. And that was part one of a series called Strange Tales of Jim Morrison. So I thought, wow, I'm onto something here. The second step was, and I've been getting this out of order so far. So this is the first time I'm getting in the correct order. The second
Awesome.
step was an interview with the manager, the at the time, estranged manager of a guy named Cliff Morrison, who claimed to be Jim's son. So I interviewed Floyd Bocox, and when he's in charge of his story. Like, he's telling me a story, and I don't want to say rehearsed, but it's like, he's got it set. He's got a prepared story. He's telling me the story, and his device is, you tell me. Like, if there's ever a question, if anything doesn't quite compute, you tell me. So he tells me about this guy, Uncle Al, who's Jim Morrison's brother-in-law, and he tells me some rather scandalous allegations about Al's involvement in the deaths of some 60s rock stars, and we know all those people who died in the 60s. Yeah. I said, wait a minute, you're telling me this guy is some kind of hitman, some kind of CIA agent or something? I think I just said hitman. And Floyd Bocox says, you tell me. So it's like, wow, well, that's a hell of an article, right? So I go to press with that article. It doesn't even occur to me to like double check. I mean, I didn't take him for granted. I didn't portray it as the truth, but I didn't double check anything. Mm-hmm. So I get a call a few days later from an elderly English voice. Now, Alan Graham, here I'll segue into like some biographical data. Alan Graham was Jim Morrison's of the Doors brother-in-law for 22 years, was married to Jim's sister, Anne. He is from Liverpool, England. He grew up with all the Beatles, and he was a teddy boy with all those Liverpool bands in that scene. Moved to London, met Anne at college, and moved with her to LA in 1967, just as the Doors album was released and the Doors were becoming very popular. So that's who it is. And he's called me, and it's his voice. I'm not going to try to imitate it. And he says, young Zack. And he always called me young Zack. I'm pretty old myself, but he was older than me. Young Zack, how dare you go to press with such slanderous allegations about me without consulting me first, not from my own mouth, without consulting me first. And I thought, well, by God, he's got a point. So, I apologize, sir. I never said it was true. I just printed what he said. And Al said, well, you're correct. And, I don't hold it against you. And we kept on talking. And I have to admit, it was a little bit like, wow, this is Jim Morrison's brother-in-law. I'm going to try to write about this guy now, So he asked me to edit a re-release of his book about Jim Morrison. I remember Jim Morrison too, and I agreed, and we began an association of client to ghostwriter / publicist that lasted about 23 years.
Wow.
From that phone call. And I know I just talked for a long time, so if you need to respond or take a break or anything.
No, you're good. You're great. 23 years, that's incredible.
A long time.
Yeah.
And I must say, and I have news for you, don't I? We can do this out of order. You remember when I mentioned that there was news about the Morrison case?
Yes.
So Al Graham, as long as I knew him, he always had a thing about going after the grifters. That word has become very big in our culture over the last several years. And it
Can you describe what that is for somebody who hasn't heard the term?
Well, in his mind, it is mostly to do with people trying to capitalize on Jim Morrison's image, and it's mostly his objection that all they do is focus on the 7 years that the Doors were popular and use all the news about the Doors to characterize Jim Morrison. Quite a valid objection, because like he knows the real person, knows him beyond the Doors, and objects to that.
Yeah.
So even at the time I met him, he was going after all the grifters. It wasn't always the Doors exploitation. Sometimes it was his neighbors. Sometimes, just anything that offended him. But he was going after this particular guy, Jeff Finn, at the time. And I didn't even remember it was the same guy, okay? But I remember now because, okay, Al passed away in March of last year. And he was 80 years old, and I forgot a lot of the minor details, but so I became aware of this movie called Before the End: Searching for Jim Morrison. The director's name is Jeff Finn, and his premise is that Jim Morrison was a victim of child abuse. He makes a few points, evidentiary points toward this, that are plausible, not conclusive, but plausible. He shows evidence of a man he calls Mr. X, who goes by Frank, who is physically very comparable to Jim Morrison and may in fact be Jim Morrison. Now I'm only going to say maybe, but it's an interesting thing, because I wrote this guy a letter having forgotten all about Al's objection to the same guy, just thinking, oh, wow, here's one that doesn't do what Al always hated. So I was like, wow, I was friends with Al Graham, and he always hated it when they only focused on the Doors, and looks like you've gone beyond that, good for you, I'd like to interview you. So Jeff Finn responds, and he's like, well, if you're friends with Al Graham, then surely you're aware of the years of psychological torture he subjected me to. And I'm thinking, oh shit, this is one of the guys that Al went after. And I think unfairly, I think improperly so. But I can understand. I mean, I don't think Al believed this to be the case about the child abuse. And if he didn't believe it and someone was saying it, he's bound to object, right?
Right.
So it was a weird thing. I'm suddenly in contact with this guy, and he's like, Al Graham, he's the devil, and I'm like, oh shit. And I have to be Al's ambassador post-mortem. So I have this conversation with this guy over the course of a few emails, and it ties into something that Al told me that the Admiral taught him, which might take a few minutes to talk about. Should I go into it?
Oh, please, go ahead.
Okay, so we're going to take a step back from the Jeff Finn thing for a second. The Admiral Stephen Morrison, Jim's father, told Al, his son-in-law at the time, about OODA loops. Have you heard that expression?
No, I haven't.
I think it's a tactical term. I think it originates in the Air Force. The Admiral was a naval admiral, but the OODA loop is observe, orient, decide, act. And it's just the 4 steps that everybody goes through before they do anything when they're challenged by a surprise. But if you break it down into those 4 steps, it becomes tactical. So I recognized, like halfway through my conversation with Jeff, or after it was over, I guess, like, wow, I was doing the OODA loop process with this guy, because I didn't know it at the time, but like I was observing what he was doing. I was like, okay, he's that guy. He's not Al's friend, but I don't think he's a bad guy. I decide what I'm going to do, and I'm going to be like, well, Al would want, the truth. Al would want me to be fair. So he's not going to want me to advocate this guy, but he's, the higher self, whatever his higher self, he wouldn't want me to just like dismiss him. So I made amends. I like wrote an article, and you may have seen it. I wrote a review of his, or an interview with Jeff Finn, called Before the End, independent filmmaker Jeff Finn, and it's on Medium, and it's on Camp Elasticity also. But I wrote an article, and it was my intention And I think I succeeded to like bury the hatchet, to like make it, where there was a wound, to make a healing.
Mm-hmm.
Call me crazy, I don't know, but that happened very recently. So that's some news, and I want to give them a plug. It's not a bad film. Before the End, Searching for Jim Morrison, and it's available on Apple TV and some other streaming platforms. Not
Awesome.
sure.
Awesome.
Yeah, so that was out of order, but we started with a big Jim Morrison, Al Graham push, which is great. Um, I want to talk about. Well, I want to thank my publisher Stephanie Larkin. I want to thank my publicist Denise. I don't know her last name. You guys have done a great job. I've been doing a whole lot of media stuff lately. I did a podcast yesterday that was not like this is great. I mean, I feel like we have a rapport and everything is cool. I was I had to go like way across town and sit in this tiny room with this guy like across the table interviewing me, and he wasn't a bad guy, but it would just put me on the back foot. That's an English expression. And I'm happy to be back. I've been doing a lot of media exposure. My alma mater invited me to feature at an alumni reading on March 6th, which is cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and I composed a poem just out of snippets of dialogue from the book, and like a lot of it's not me, but it's like a soundscape of the whole book, kind of in the form of a poem.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to read it, don't worry.
I just want to quickly plug. So, you guys who are in the chat here, a lot of you might recognize Zack. His handle is Camp Elasticity Productions, and that's the name of his Instagram, where Zack has been posting a ton. Like, I've been seeing your posts. Yeah, you haven't been joking. You have been doing a lot of media stuff to promote this book. So if you guys go over to his Instagram, give him a follow, you'll be able to see all of these things that he's talking about. So.
Thanks. I've been having fun with all the free advertising tech that there is on Facebook and my YouTube. And
I thought you were going to say MySpace. I was like, wait, what?
Not yet. There's always tomorrow. But like, and I did a great another great podcast appearance on something called The Composite with Deanne Battle. You can find that on YouTube, and there's also a Facebook fan page called Rare But Serious Countercultural Studies 2025 Plus. Everyone should send a request to or join. And on the Composite with Deanne Battle, I think the first time she pre-interviewed me, and I had trouble with it. She asked me to answer what is a counterculture. And I was like, oh, wait, what do you mean? But my mind's been working on that, and I thought of an example or a little spiel to make. Almost anyone you can think of began as a non-political gathering of people who wanted to have fun. They wanted to make art. They wanted to be creative. They wanted to, do something loving. They weren't trying to they weren't having a protest rally. They weren't doing politics at all, but they all inevitably got infiltrated by political consciousness, some worse than others. And I thought of a few things to say about this. Have you heard the song Nature Boy by Nat King Cole?
I can't picture it or like hear it offhand, but I'm sure I have.
So that song, the lyrics and I think the melody to that song were presented to Nat King Cole by a guy named Eden Abe, I think is the pronunciation, Ahbez, he was a hermit basically who lived in the Hollywood Hills under the Hollywood sign. He wore a robe, he made sandals, he wore sandals, grew his hair long, had a beard. This was in the 40s. Before there was even officially a Beat Generation, before the hippies started doing the same thing in the mid to late 60s. And, that's an example of atavism instead of activism, a word that just means returning to the root, like being a nature boy. And he was part of a crowd called the Nature Boys, apparently a whole bunch of people in the 40s in LA were doing that. Some of them were surfers, some of them were just vegetarians. That kind of began the whole health food movement in that part of the country. So that was a counterculture. And it was an idea of somebody just wanting to not do what the society was doing. Now,
Mm.
before we get to the question, let me just finish really quick. Um, the merry pranksters who toured the USA before LSD was illegal, having parties where people were given LSD and given the opportunity to try it out, they had a saying, stay in your own movie. So that means don't let anyone else be the director, much less the starring role in your own life. Stay in your own movie. Um, and that applies to everything. I wasn't sure. I think I was told at one point who coined the phrase. At first, I thought it was Neil Cassidy, but it wasn't. But I always associate it with the way the merry pranksters would get pulled over in their psychedelically painted bus before such a thing. I mean, it was the first one before they ever had those. That was the one that they ever had. And that bus would get pulled over. Neil Cassidy had a way of talking the police out of giving him any tickets or anything more than a warning just because he had the gift of gab, just because he was such a prattler. And I feel like that kind of goes with stay in your own movie because he would probably change the subject, redirect the attention. But the point is, like, you're the star. You're not the guy who gets arrested. You're the guy, if it comes to a confrontation with a police officer, you're the guy who talks your way out of getting arrested and you're in your own movie. You don't let his movie, because he's got a movie. He's like, these people are up to no good. I'm going to be in this, I'm going to do what I'm doing. But don't let that narrative override your own narrative. So that's okay. And then the ending to that, I won't name names, but there are merry pranksters alive today, and they've got a page on Facebook, and it's someone I admire very much, who's taken recent political events much to heart and reposting a whole lot of urgent stuff. And I can't say he's wrong. I won't say he's wrong because I've done it myself, right? You've
Mhm.
seen me do it. But I saw that he was doing it a lot, and I thought, stay in your own movie, George. Oh, stay in your own movie. And I put that comment, and he said, thanks, I'm not quitting. And I realized, wow, his movie is different. Staying in his movie doesn't even mean what it means to me.
Mhm.
Like, so that's one harkening back, kind of like from the past to the present. And I almost wore a shirt tonight that said "Ignore Alien Orders," which is a sticker that's always on Jim or Joe Strummer's guitar, and I think that's very relevant right now
Yeah,
too.
absolutely.
Like if yeah, if that's all that has to be said. Um, but yeah, there was a question, and I want it to stay dynamic. So, or was it a comment?
No, so Discerning Light knew exactly who you were talking about in regards to the song about the real
Yeah,
Nature
cool.
Boy. He wrote songs and has an album. So thank you, because I didn't know that answer.
Yeah, he's got several and he didn't make it into the book because I didn't end up doing the research until it was already published. But he belongs in the second edition for sure.
Yeah. So I know we were on before, we did talk a bit about Jim Morrison's legacy as well as the Merry Pranksters. Obviously, here we're going a little bit more in depth. But besides them, you interviewed quite, I mean, this is one of the things we talked about off camera before we went live is I mean, there's so many interviews in this book that you have conducted over decades of work. And what are some, who are some names that you want to specifically kind of reference for the readers, if you don't mind, even just a couple that you think people might um, be like, oh, wow, this interview's in this book. Or maybe some names where you're like, you might not know this name, but you're going to want to read about this in my book.
Well, let me go through it as quickly as possible. There are several essays that came from when I was in grad school, a couple from before. That's Charles Bukowski, John Fonte, The Beat Generation, Jim Morrison's Legacy, we talked about a little already. Charles Manson, mostly about his will. Hunter S. Thompson, Paul Williams, anti-folk genre of music. Philip K. Dick, Jonathan Richman, a Boston name. You ever heard that name, Jonathan Richman? Paul Krasner, founder of the Yippies, and David Byrne, Mala Gaunkar, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, and more, and interviews with Johnny Strike from the band Crime. We should talk about that tonight. Paul Krasner, Gary Lackman from Blondie's an author, Tamra Lucid, a riot girl from a band called Lucid Nation, Cliff Morrison, Jim's presumptive son, the Jazz Butcher, Pat Fish, Juan Thompson, that's Hunter's son, Alan Graham, Eddie Shaw from the Monks. We should talk about the Monks tonight. And I don't want to overstay my welcome. Dan Fonte, Ronnie Pontiac, Aram Soroyan, Michael McQuaid, Jamie Cassidy, Neil Cassidy's daughter, Gary Wilson, Angelo Moore from Fishbone, Nadia Zold, an independent director, Mark Sink, A.D. Winans, Tom Ross, an AI metaphysician. We'll talk about him tonight. Gerald Nicosia, a poet, a writer, and more. And writing about the fight over Charles Manson's will, how Paul is dead, won't die, how the Laurel Canyon scene might have been a setup, Philip K. Dick's 2374 experience, the brief misfortunes of Billy Burroughs, and more.
Oh my goodness.
So many. I didn't know who to highlight, but
that's amazing. So yeah, let's talk about some of the names that you really wanted to get into. I personally, because I am intrigued, what is the Philip K. Dick's legendary 2374 experience?
So Philip K. Dick was a science fiction author, and on would be February the 3rd, 2374, 1974, he had an experience where somebody came to the door, a girl came to the door collecting donations, and she had a Pisces amulet, like token around her neck. And that was the original sign of the Christians. So Philip, and at that exact moment he felt, or maybe not the exact moment, but around the same time, he felt that a beam of pink light had been fired into his third eye, and he had seen through it. The Greek word is ekphrasis. He had seen through like the overlying fiction to the true nature of reality. And the thing that he brought back was the empire never ended. So like very heavy stuff, and had some influence on, I would say, countercultural spirituality, as did several other influences that were not straightforward spiritual influences. But yeah, and he wrote a trilogy called the Valis Trilogy. That's his metaphor, his acronym for Vast Active Living Intelligent System, which is what he considers to be God. This is heavy stuff. This goes right to the idea that life is the reality is a simulation. And he wrote 3 books that are considered the Valis Trilogy, but the actual third volume, was never published during his lifetime. His widow, who I hope is still with us, Tessa Dick, wrote and published it. It's called The Owl in Daylight. And that whole trilogy is all about like hidden realities, like pointing out a lot of stuff that people take for granted and don't think about twice. And excellent, interesting stuff. I think there's been a graphic novel done about Philip K. Dick. I don't know who the artist is, but I don't think it was, I mean, it certainly wasn't who I almost said it was, so I don't know. Look for it.
So Capone here in the chat says, Philip K. Dick is buried in the next town over from where I grew up, Morgan, Colorado. And then Matilda commented, saw Jonathan Richman 3 times in the 90s.
Beautiful. Isn't he great? Some of the best shows I've ever seen. He's a real showman.
Nice. As we're going through, everybody who's watching live, if you guys have a question, put it in the chat, and we will definitely get Zach
Yes,
to
thank you.
try
I
to answer.
welcome and I accept all questions. Philip K. Dick's gravesite, I've never been, but Tom Ross, who I referenced earlier, the AI metaphysician, he reveres Philip K. Dick. Makes sense, that he would. And he invited me along to go see Philip K. Dick's grave one time. And I didn't go because it was like an impromptu, unexpected invitation. Probably should have gone. I'll make it one of these times.
Wow. So I know there's a lot that you want to talk about because the book covers a lot. But I'm very curious about, so you want to talk about, you said Johnny Strike?
A little bit, yeah. I
Yeah.
feel I should. Um, so the band he was in is called Crime, all capital letters. They were the first punk band in San Francisco. Now, a lot of people think the Sex Pistols were the first punk band because they made such an impact in '77. But the scene most likely started in Detroit with a band called Death, three black brothers. I won't go there right now. Death is a great band though. But Johnny Strike was in a band called Crime, the first San Francisco punk band, and they, as their stage gimmick was, they would dress up as police officers. Like, you can get a costume that looks like a police officer. I mean, and maybe not anymore, but back then you could. And
Right.
they played San Quentin once in police officer uniforms. What a trip that was! And they played under, I think it was called the no there was some rule that meant like if they were taken hostage, the prison was not responsible for what might happen to them.
Oh my
So it was like a
gosh.
very daring kind of thing to do, but it was very punk rock spirited thing to do, I suppose. Also, um, anyway, Johnny Strike was my pen pal before I became a freelance writer because he was a writer too, and I knew that he was like a fan of Paul Bowles and Burroughs and the Beats and all the same kind of crowd that I was like a fan of. So I started being his pen pal. And the last email I got from him, like I had, or maybe the one before the last email was sort of garbled, like half finished, like wow, maybe something's wrong, and then the one after that was just a video clip encouraging people to suggest to the library that they carry his books. And I just thought, somehow felt like, wow, maybe he's on his way out.
Mm.
And in a few days he did pass away. And my first freelance article for Please Kill Me was a eulogy for Johnny Strike. Um, can I stop and explain, Pete? Please Kill Me. I'll be pretty quick about it.
Oh my gosh. No, take your time. Absolutely.
So there was a band called the Heartbreakers, and one of the members was Richard Hell. If you've heard of the New York Dolls, this is a band Johnny Thunder started after the New York Dolls. Richard Hell was one of the members. They were one of the first punk bands, and in the fashion statement Richard Hell made was he would wear a torn up shirt with "Please Kill Me" written on it, just like the ultimate statement of disaffection and you know whatever, disgustedness with society or something, like just get me out
Yeah.
of here. And Johnny Rotten notably took all his fashion style from Richard Hell, like the haircut and the clothing and everything. Maybe not, but that's been argued. It seems credible. Um, so what am I talking about here? So that's why that book, Please Kill Me, has that title, and the website, pleasekillme.com, has that title.
Gotcha.
So
Okay.
so that was my first shot at the big time, I suppose, came thanks to Johnny Strike, who passed away, God rest him.
Aw. Oh, that's so sad. Oh my gosh. As you were saying that, I'm like, that's so sad that you like felt that he was on his way.
There's a
Oh,
lot. I mean, gosh, this book has a lot of people's last interviews in it, I think, and I don't want to say I'm afraid because, that's pretty marvelous. in itself, like that I should have been the recipient of these last, or towards the end kind of interviews from people. So that's maybe something to recommend the book too.
Yeah. And it would be very interesting to kind of, as a reader, kind of read these interviews, kind of knowing that, I mean, sadly knowing that it was going to be maybe close to one of their last interviews. And then just to see how that, I would feel how that differs from other ones, just the tone of that. I mean, that's something I
Mm,
would look for, but.
that's great. You're my target audience. Wow.
So
Yeah,
you're all,
like,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
oh no, you go first because I have to compose it a little bit.
Oh, I didn't want to switch off of Johnny Strike and Crime, and I wanted to make sure I didn't jump
No,
ahead.
I think we've covered them because there's
Awesome.
so much to talk about. Um, but I
So you
did I
Eddie
did want
Shaw.
Eddie Shaw, yes. So Eddie Shaw, have you ever heard of a band called the Monks? Some of your
I
audience
am not.
might.
I've heard of the Monkeys,
Okay.
which I know
So
is totally different.
no, but the Monks are worth checking out.
Okay.
Um, they're a band from the early 60s, and they were a bunch of ex-American former GIs who ended up in Hamburg, in the same, which is the same town where the Beatles played all the clubs, right? And all those clubs, some of them are probably still open, but they were still open when the Monks were there, just a few years after the Beatles. And the Monks became a sensation in Hamburg, and their team of managers were three advertising students. I mean, I don't know the name of the university, probably in that area, who decided like the best strategy for these times, we need a band like this, right?
Hmm.
So they they devised their own musical style that was all based on mathematics, and I mean, music is anyway to a degree, or maybe completely always based on mathematics, but they devised their own like tempo or something, and they all their songs sound like very different from the songs you're used to, and they did everything basically point by point diametrically the opposite of the Beatles, because they wanted to be different and they wanted to be challenging, and they were literally the first shock rock band on the advice of their managers, like this is the kind of band you got to be. So they shaved their heads like monks in a monk's tonsure, and they wore monks' robes, and they hung around in Hamburg, which is like a city of vice and prostitution and degradation, and they scandalized all the ordinary residents of Hamburg because of how they looked, and they would be out in the bars drinking with whores, and kissing whores on the street, and then people were scandalized. These are supposed to be monks.
Hmm.
But anyway, I thought, like, are they still alive? Is there any way I can interview? And I found Eddie Shaw. He may be the only surviving member. He's, I think, 92 years old now. And he was just a very personable, friendly guy. And there's an interview in the book with a lot of pictures from Hamburg of Eddie Shaw. And the Monks are really great. My favorite song by them is called Yellow Grass, and it's the soundtrack to one of my recent Instagram promotions, and it'll be labeled.
Nice. So my apologies if my internet is a little shoddy. You are good. I can just tell mine's a little shoddy. Um,
I can't tell.
okay. Well, thank you. So yeah, I want to, once you do find one of the pictures, I'll take myself off the screen so you can show it as best you can. Um, and as you're flipping through, I can see you have a decent amount of pictures in that book too.
I sure do.
Nice.
And I should have found out before this interview if the color versions are available yet, but I'll definitely let you know, and I'll post that link when
Yeah.
I've got it. Boy, oh, here it is. Oh, wait, no, it's not.
I see a few people coming in the chat a little late. Hi, everyone. Welcome. If you guys have
Hi,
any
everyone. Here it
questions
is.
for Zack, please feel free to leave them in the chat.
Okay, I found it. Sorry for the delay.
No, you're good. Yeah, let me take myself off.
Here are the monks' managers. I don't know if you can see that. The three managers, the German students, advertising students. And here's a good picture of the monks and the way they looked in Hamburg. And here's a picture of them scandalizing one of the residents. I guess they were smoking cigarettes or something. So yeah, just wanted to show a few pictures there.
Awesome. No picture. We love pictures. We love pictures. It definitely, because you, at least for me, if I'm reading about someone I don't know, I like to have a reference of who it is. So I find that very helpful. Because especially
It's
because,
very
as I
helpful.
mentioned, you have some names in here that I don't know. So to be able to put a face to a name is always a great thing.
And I'm happy to provide that service of like passing on knowledge that has been, outmoded or like overlooked. I'm glad to be an archivist and share those treasures.
Yeah. So I know one of the things that I'm shocked no one has asked yet. So I will ask the question, and I know we're not going to get like a ton into it because that could be a whole conversation in itself. But the battle over Charles Manson's will. So how did you get involved with researching and writing about that?
I've always been curious about the Manson family, and I want to make the point. I want to make a particular point about Manson, not to do with the will, but um, I just was writing an article about him. I was doing an article about how he doesn't seem to have had the rights to his image since he was convicted, and how maybe no convicts ever do after they're convicted have the right to their image, and
Mm,
how like people could basically say whatever they wanted about him, and they did actually create a whole effigy of who he was, just with nobody ever having any right to contradict any assertions. So I was writing about that, and that's where I came across like, oh wow, and then there's this Jason Freeman thing, and there's this will, and there are all these people get involved, and Michael Channels was one of the claimants, and I had interviewed him previously, so I included that article, and that's in the book too, folded into the article about Manson's will is my interview with Michael Channels.
nice.
Um, and the point I wanted to make that I forgot to make in the other cast was about, have you ever heard of someone named Jack Black, not the actor, but somebody else from a long
I
time
have
ago?
not.
So there was a guy named Jack Black who wrote a book, I think in 1924, called You Can't Win. And he was a reformed morphine addict who had been a traveler, a hobo, back in the days when hobos were like a whole scene to themselves. They were a counterculture unto themselves, as a matter of fact, in America for a long time. Um, excuse me. But Jack Black was a criminal, for a lifelong criminal. He had spent a lot of time on the railroad, in the railroad scene with the hobos, and he came across the Johnson family. That was a euphemism for a crew of outlaws who obeyed an internal code of honesty, who like never snitched on anyone, never ever 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 snitched on anyone, never ever had anything to do with any law enforcement officers, never, just kept like a strict code. The Johnson family kept a strict code of like moral integrity, but it was like, to be an outlaw you must be honest. It was an outlaw's integrity, but it was integral and sturdy and strong. And I feel like that's what kind of character Manson was. Because, I
Mm,
mean, not that he came from that scene in particular, literally, but like if you notice, he never quite ever snitches on anyone. The
right.
closest I've ever seen him come is he says, well, they said why they did what they said they did in their own books. Like he
Mhm.
never says, like, Tex did this or, anything like
Right.
that. He'll make little observations about their character, but he'll never snitch. And I wanted to make that point because Jack Black was a big influence on the young William Burroughs, who like developed his own whole trip about outlaws and narcs and interzone and all the books that he wrote were definitely colored by the book that Jack Black wrote, You Can't Win, in 1924, which has been republished with cover art by Joe Coleman, although I don't think that's the current version. But he's famous punk rock associated artist Joe Coleman, or Cole, might be Joe Cole.
Okay. Yeah. The Charles Manson's that's a whole thing in itself, but it's still ongoing, which is years and years. So yeah, I look forward to reading about your interview with Michael Channels personally. Yeah.
Right on.
Yeah, Michael Channels he has his own YouTube channel, Back Porch Tapes, so very informative as well. So
I haven't spoken with him in years. I should definitely drop him a line.
Oh yeah, that would be his channel he's posting a lot of information on that. So if people are interested in that little aspect, that's definitely a place to go.
Sure.
I didn't want this comment to go overlooked, but it's a little bit ago. But Matilda says, I have to get this book. So many cool people.
Thank you, Matilda. And it's available at Amazon. It's available at barnesandnoble.com. Not sure where else. Those two I know for sure.
Awesome. So some of the other topics that you wanted to cover, I want to make sure that we don't lose those. I know you have your list of checkpoints.
We've gone through a lot of it already. I'm just trying to track down what hasn't been talked about yet.
So I personally would love if you went into some of the theories surrounding the Laurel Canyon music scene.
Sure. So, I just found more. So, so most of the rock stars we've heard of from the flower power scene, which definitely began in Laurel Canyon, have parentage in the military, and usually in the information section of the military. And that's just a fact, and it doesn't really prove anything. But why were they all there in that place, and why did they all do what they did? And was it an accident, or was it an operation where they weren't aware that they were being used, or was it a conscious operation? Just a curious thing. And I don't want to make any definite statements. There's been a lot of speculation that Jim Morrison was in fact some kind of observed, individual, like an individual with special oversight. There have been allegations made that like he got arrested in Miami, he got arrested at another concert, I can't remember where. There have been speculations that it was all kind of like, what kind of effect can a charismatic singer have on a crowd? Like, can he incite them to a riot? Can he, just a speculation. I'm not saying it's true, but that's where it comes in on Morrison. Frank Zappa's father was a specialist in chemical agents, harmful chemical agents, warfare. And they were immigrants, and that trumps it for most people, but he still was in the U.S. anyway. But I don't want to get into allegations like this, because one of the things that I'm learning as I'm writing about other people's lives is I really don't have the right to make assertions about what is the case. And I'm trying to stay an intermediatist, which is a very antique word, but it comes from a guy named Charles Fort, who said that a circle is measured beginning anywhere. So he saw the truth as open to interpretation. Everyone has an angle on the truth, and he referred to himself as an intermediatist. So that's the position I try to take in my reportage on other people's circumstances. And I might sometimes slip up, but hopefully not often.
There's something to be said for that, especially in this day and age where it's so easy to just put that out there, but to make that conscious choice of like, no, that's not what we're doing here. So I think that's awesome.
Well, I think it gives you a broader view. It gives you a broader range of possibilities to consider and to like include in your description
Yeah,
of whatever you're looking at.
absolutely. Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, I have read quite a bit on Frank Zappa in regards to his time at the Laurel, living in
Mhm.
Laurel Canyon, and that in itself is a whole trip to read about.
Yeah, the log cabin,
Yes.
right? And that was later lived in by somebody else from another era, and I can't think of who it is at all. But it was pretty good. I'll
Yeah.
get back to you on that.
Yeah, and even
Either previous or subsequent, not sure.
yeah, there was a lot of like even in the reading about Frank Zappa and that, and there was just like even just that one cabin, there were so many musicians coming and going. And then when you add all the other musicians who lived in Laurel Canyon, it was the same thing. It's like exactly like you said, everybody was
The
there.
Monkees, as I recall, were
My
even
favorite
part of
bands.
it.
That's my favorite band.
Oh, no kidding! Wow,
Hmm.
last train to Clarksville.
Yes, I just saw Mickey Dolenz in concert a few months ago.
No kidding!
Yeah, that's like I think my third or fourth time seeing him live. Yeah, favorite
Wow.
band.
So you don't know about Jonathan Richman, or do you?
I don't. I don't.
He's from Boston. I think he lives somewhere far from Boston now, but he's got a lot of music about Boston. He's got a song called "The Fenway." I'll send you a link. He's a big hero of mine. He like I said, Death is probably the first punk band. Nobody was using that word at the time, but Jonathan Richman definitely one of the early moves in that direction. And he didn't keep going in that direction. Interesting thing about Jonathan Richman, his band is called the Modern Lovers, and they were like their first album was produced by John Cale from the Velvet Underground. They were primed for rock star dumb. They were going to be like the next big shots, of the rock scene. Jonathan Richman, much like I guess Prince years later, didn't want any part of that fame scene and right away was like, no, I don't want this rock star thing at all. I'm going to play acoustic guitar now. I want smaller audiences. I don't want an amplifier. And that was just a phase. He went back to some amplifiers later, but he's my hero because he's like the star of doing what he wanted to do the whole time. Like he tried to do that, it worked, he decided not, and he kept doing what he wanted to do. And he's still alive. He's like maybe 70 years old, approaching 70 years old, and he's still making his living as a musician and touring. So yeah, I digress, but I digress.
Well, I need to
Um,
look that up. Yeah, especially with the Boston connection. Shame that I don't know that. So that's on me.
well, also maybe because he didn't want to be famous, he probably just he
Good
didn't
point.
make he didn't make it into the radar. Um, so I found a whole section. Unless there's more you want to talk about, I found a whole
No,
section
please
that
go ahead. This
I
is
didn't
your time. Absolutely.
write on. So I wanted to talk about. Have you heard of Edgar Casey?
I have not.
Edgar Casey was called the sleeping prophet. He was a very religious guy, and he was a Christian, and he was hypnotized. And while hypnotized, he started to speak about things that were like very heretical, like reincarnation and karma and dimensional travel and things that like the waking Edgar Casey would not have approved of or believed in. But he didn't start out talking about that stuff. He started out giving medical recommendations, and he would just recommend these cures that no one had ever considered, and they would always work. So there's like whole books of medical recommendations by Edgar Casey. And then one day, a psychiatrist or hypnotist by the name of Lammers decided, like, I wonder what had happened if I asked him about, reincarnation. Never thought to do that before. So he asked him, what about reincarnation? And Edgar Casey starts holding forth at length about reincarnation and karma and solar travel and all this stuff that, like, he consciously would not have approved of, or believed in, or had given any credence to. But anyway, so he began as giving medical cures, and he became like a spiritual spokesman, always while hypnotized. There's whole libraries of books by Edgar Casey on different soul troubles people might be having, and especially books on reincarnation, books on karma. Anyway, Neil Cassidy, Dean Moriarty from On the Road, he had a lifelong, I can talk about Manson here again too. He had a lifelong struggle with lust and excess. Like he really liked to have a good time. He used to steal cars just to go on joyrides with girls up into the mountains and then bring it back and park it where he found it. And he was a countercultural soul, he just wasn't playing by the rules. So that was the one side. And then the other side, he never felt like a respectable part of society because he had grown up in flop houses with an alcoholic father and beaten up by his stepbrothers and just never really felt like he belonged. So he met Carolyn Cassidy, and this romance is all spelled out in On the Road by Jack Kerouac. And he found, their meeting is talked about it On the Road, but he ended up marrying her, and he had he had 3 children with her, Jamie and Kathy and John Allen Cassidy. I'm friends most closely with Jamie of those 3, and I'm friends with his son, Robert Hyatt, who was given up for adoption in Denver before he even began the Beat Generation. Good friends with Bob Hyatt. I haven't talked about him enough on here. Look for his book. It's called Beat Bastard, available on Amazon. So Neil Cassidy had a particular relationship with Kerouac, where Kerouac always looked up to him as kind of an older brother. Kerouac had a real older brother who died. So when he met Neil Cassidy, he projected all that love onto this guy that he admired, and he really looked to Neil Cassidy as like the hero, the ideal. And let's see, where am I going with this? I was just talking about, okay. So when Neil Cassidy became so devoted to Edgar Casey, and he would write about it all the time in his letters to Jack Kerouac and Ginsberg and all the other beats, and he was always talking about Edgar Casey, and they weren't quite sure how to take it because Casey's a Christian, he's not a Buddhist or anything, so it's like, I don't know, this Casey thing. Ginsberg's into Buddhism. Kerouac got really into Buddhism, and he wrote so much about Buddhism. He wrote like Buddhist scriptures, a whole book of Buddhist scriptures, and he constantly made references to the Buddha and to Buddhism. And it's been suggested that this was a direct result of Cassidy's devotion to Edgar Casey, just because it preceded it in time, but I don't know. But that's a development in the spirituality of the masses, because Kerouac's a big shot, Neil Cassidy's a big shot, especially then he joins the Merry Pranksters. He becomes famous a second time driving the Merry Pranksters bus. So Edgar Casey is like a suggestion of karma, reincarnation, and that's entering the Western thought stream one of the first times. Around the same time as Edgar Casey, there's another guy, similar guy named Manly P. Hall. Manly P. Hall is not a psychic, he's a researcher, and he writes a book called The Secret Teachings of All Ages. He starts an organization called the Philosophical Research Society in Los Angeles. And Charles Bukowski was married there. I don't think he was a devotee or anything, but that was his wife's chosen venue. So Charles Bukowski got married there. Ronnie Pontiac, okay, I'm charting the development of spirituality from the 60s to today. We're going to end with Tom Ross, the AI metaphysician. and then we can do questions. And we can, if anyone has a question along the way, you can interrupt me too. But
no, this is fascinating. I'm absolutely fascinated.
Right on. So we got Kerouac Buddhism, we got Neil Casey, Edgar Casey, Kerouacian Buddhism, and then the 60s happen, and all this stuff happens. There's the communes and LSD and meditation and people going to India. There's a thing called the hippie trail where they go from America all through India up to Tibet. And Manson is an example of a dark side of this. And I want to say Cassidy and Manson are very similar backgrounds, very similar tendencies, very similar characters, but not identical. And Cassidy always had the love for, greatness and excelling, going beyond. And I feel like Manson always wanted to go inside and be safe and be kind of contained. Like, I don't think he was an evil genius exactly, but I think he wanted to be removed and, off in the desert and kind of unto himself.
Right.
And I have this whole weird theory about societal bodies and antibodies. There's other examples like the Beatles and the monks, the body and the antibody. And there's Cassidy and Manson. And then there's Donald Trump and Larry Flint. Interesting, because they're both these rich guys. They're both given to excess. Larry Flint, as opposed to Donald Trump, he wants more liberty. He wants freedom of the press. He wants freedom. And Donald Trump wants the opposite, allegedly. So there's that. And then we're talking about how it gets to the point, okay, we got to talk about the Riot Girl movement here as a little segue, because Tamara Lucid and Ronnie Pontiac were both members of a band called Lucid Nation, which was one of the Riot Girl bands, an early Riot Girl band. Some other names I can drop here are Team Dresch, D-R-E-S-C-H, Bikini Kill with Kathleen Hanna, you've heard of her, and Lucid Nation with Tamara Lucid and Ronnie Pontiac. Now, Manly P. Hall, who I mentioned earlier, the Philosophical Research Society, and I wish I had saved a picture to show you of him, but he was a trailblazer of metaphysical exposure in the West. He was a young firebrand, and then he grew up into an old man, and he was a respected, revered minister and speaker, and he's written a number of books. And Ronnie Pontiac from Lucid Nation came to Manly P. Hall's service. Okay, Ronnie Pontiac is a very interesting story. He started reading about the occult because he wanted to learn how to cast spells on people. He wanted to be powerful. He wanted to be mean and powerful. And he tried reading Aleister Crowley to figure this out. And he saw that that's not what Crowley was doing, right? So he's kind of a seeker. He's a frustrated seeker. He comes across Manly P. Hall. Manly P. Hall is giving a lecture, and Ronnie Pontiac's a total stranger. Manly P. Hall says something to him about, I can't remember what, but something that's been on his mind. And this turns out to be a thing that Manly P. Hall always did when he chose you for whatever reason. He would look at you directly and say something during his sermon that would have relevance. And Ronnie Pontiac became his substitute lecturer, experienced a total transcendence event and became a knowledgeable student of metaphysics. He's written a book called American Metaphysical Religion, which is great, and Lucid Nation, also great. And that's an interesting example, those two. Tamara Lucid's also written a book called Making the Ordinary Extraordinary, My Years in the LA with Manly P. Hall. Those are both great books, and I'm very grateful to both of them for letting me interview them and appearing in my book. And Tamara just recently reposted my post advertising the book. Thank you very much.
Awesome.
And So I want to name another couple names in that connection. Gary Lackman from Blondie. He was Gary Valentine in Blondie, and he's a respected author in the metaphysical field. He's published, I think, 7 or 8 books by now, all very good books. Gary Lackman, Lachman, and Mitch Horowitz. I haven't, well, he's written a book called American Occult. He's written a number of books, and he looks like a punk rocker. I don't know anything about his background, but I'm calling this little subgroup here, I'm calling it punk metaphysics. And maybe it's the new subculture, and maybe it's not a counterculture anymore. Maybe it's just a subculture. And I want to close my portion here by talking about Tom Ross. We've all heard about AI. Now, when I discovered AI, I wasn't automatically against it. I thought, like, well, I'm an artist. You can always use anything like an artist. And the way I cracked it was to use it as an oracle and to interpret the results of my text to image using intuitive art therapy. So I mean, that's like refusing to take AI on its own terms. And I had made my peace with it. Now that there's a new administration, and apparently they're removing all the safeguards, and it's kind of like, well, wow, why? How can I trust this anymore? But my first exposure to it, I was on LinkedIn, and I've ghostwritten some books. I ghost wrote some books for Al Graham, and I've been an agent. I was an agent for Robert Hyatt, Neil Cassidy's son. I got Beat Bastard, a publisher. So that's on my LinkedIn profile, agent. And I heard one day from this guy, Tom Ross, and he says, I'm an AI metaphysician. Are you still an agent? And I said, well, hey, maybe so. We can talk about that, but would you like to be on a podcast next week? That sounds interesting, AI metaphysician. And his whole platform, very solid platform, is like we've all heard the debate or the point of confusion about AI gaining sentience. Like, is it going to go mad and take over, or is it going to help us, or like, what can we do to make sure it goes in the right direction? And one of the first things Tom Ross said to me that really got me was, it's exactly the same situation as the Garden of Eden and the Tree of Knowledge and the serpent who wants you to know and God who doesn't want you to know. And now there's like AI, and there's sentience or not, and there's corporations who don't want you to be sentient, or there's the public who don't want you to be sentient, the corporations that do, and just the same thing repeating.
Interesting.
So I co-hosted a few speaking events with Tom Ross, and he's a good guy. You should check out his hexology. It's called US6, and that's available on any streaming platform or any online book sales platform. I mean, there.
Oh my goodness. That is fascinating. That is absolutely fascinating. And so spot on comparing that to the Garden of Eden. As you're saying that, I was like, oh my God.
He's a very intelligent man. And then like most of the people I'm interested by, I won't say he's right or wrong, but not wrong.
Oh my
That's
goodness.
something.
Oh my goodness. And I just want to say, you also like shouted out so many other people and so many other authors and books and platforms to find people. So if there's probably like 20 different rabbit holes that you gave in this in coming on tonight's show. People are like, oh, I want to learn about that. So
right on. And the only thing I would say, and thanks, if anyone buys my book From the Heart, thank you very much. The only thing I would say, leave a review. I guess it helps with sales, but enjoy it. I hope you like it.
Yeah. So are there any other upcoming interviews or anything press related, going on other podcasts or whatnot, where people can hear those and hear you talk about the book and maybe kind of get different things from those interviews as well?
I'm going to be appearing, I'm going to be appearing on the VCFA Alumnix reading on March 6th. I'm not sure off the top of my head what the link is. I can send it to you though, Dani, and you can tell your followers.
Yeah, I'll share it.
We'll appear on the Composite with Deanne battle, and we haven't set a date for that yet.
Awesome. Wow, you have been super busy. Thank you for coming on this channel.
Oh, thank you so much.
So just shout out to Discerning Light here in the chat, who like followed with every way more knowledgeable than I am. Yeah, saw Jonathan Richmond at the Troubadour in Palomino back in the 90s. That's awesome.
New kind of neighborhood. I think that one's about Venice Beach, though.
Manly P. Hall started as a magician.
Oh, yeah. I think so. Well, I'm not sure. Did he? I'm not sure. He was researching ancient knowledge. I don't know that he began as a magician. He may have, though. I mean, nothing wrong with that.
Capone says, I can't quite remember from the first time that that Zack was on, but did Zack ever write for Modern Drunkard magazine?
I may have had something in Modern Drunkard at some point, but I can't remember. But I know it. I'm familiar with it, and I know people involved with it.
Yeah, and your website too has when I first when you were on before and I went through your website has a lot of information with articles that you've written. So that in itself, I mean, there's so much to explore there too. And I did put a description of your website, Camp Elasticity Productions, in the drop-down bar. So people can check that out for sure. Does anybody have any last-minute questions before we wrap up with Zack? I know Zack has already said it while you've been on, but let's get this again. Where can people find your book, Rare But Serious?
Amazon for sure, barnesandnoble.com for sure. And I'll get a comprehensive list and I'll start posting it.
Awesome.
Because I think it's more than that.
Yes. And like he said, leave a review. Leave a review. That is very, very helpful.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. As we're winding things down, I'm just double checking my notes that I got. We touched on everything. There's so much in here, but I typically anytime I do a full book review on my channel, just because I'm always curious to see. So how many pages is your book? So the readers, because I can't quite tell when you hold it up.
It's kind of thick. It's the reason it covers so much material is because it was articles, interviews, essays from 25 years. It's 312.
That's awesome. That is awesome.
Rare but serious.
Rare but serious. Yeah, with all the names that you had mentioned that you had conversations with and and interviewed and had essays on. Yeah, I'm shocked that you could fit that all into 300 pages. You could have probably easily done another 100.
And ever since I turned in the final, I keep thinking of things I forgot to add. So there's going to have to be a second version. Let me say one thing about the title. That's a reference to the side effects that come after the clash between art and order, between creativity and regulation. Creates rare but serious side effects.
That is so cool. That is so cool. All right, couple of comments. Cool, great information. Yes. So thank you, Zack. Thank you so much for coming back on
Thank you so much for having me back.
All right, everybody, make sure that you order his book, leave a review, check out his website, follow on Instagram, because I've been seeing all the stuff Zack's been doing to promote his new book. So follow that on Instagram so that you can see it too as well. So
thanks, Dani.
You're welcome. Anytime. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Dani After Dark. And again, huge shout out to Zack, author of Rare But Serious. All right, everybody, have a great rest of your evening. And remember, until next time, we don't live in darkness. Darkness lives in us. Bye, everyone.